Okay, all right.
So our goal for going over this, using this case and going over it, is to have the room understand some of the ethical issues that are present or can come up when we practice research. And we're going to do that using this case, which is very, very famous. And our objectives, and you might have a little bit of a difficulty understanding what goals and objectives are, and that's fine. We will talk about them later on in the day, but we have tried to frame all of our work in this institute, beginning stating a goal and stating objectives. And so even if it's not clear now, it will become clearer, and don't worry about it. But it's good for you to see that we have some specific things we want to achieve with our session. And so our objectives are that the audience, you, will recognize ethical problems when you read about them or when you look at complex research and you have questions about their veracity and their truthfulness. And that when we are here and we're working on this example, that you will be able to identify ethical issues and make connections between them as they relate to the way this case unfolds. And as I said, this case is about the uses of embryonic stem cells. And for those of you who do not know what these cells are or how they are derived, these come from fertilized eggs. And these eggs go through a number of growth phases, which happen over the course of about a week. And at some point, when they are at the stage of what we call the blastocyst, then the researcher can remove the cells with a pipette in the laboratory and then put them on a petri dish and try to keep them in cell culture, as we say. So this is outside the body under laboratory conditions. This has been a very hard thing to do. It's really a very difficult thing to keep human embryonic stem cells in culture. And so this has been something that researchers have been working to achieve for a very long time. And the reason that we are interested in the stem cells and that people have been focused on them is that they have, because they are the beginning cells, the progenitor cells as we call them, they have the potential to become any kind of tissue in the body. And so when to have this in the cell culture, so this is outside an organism, this can happen based on the different nutrients one can put on a petri dish. Within the body, this happens because of hormonal influences, because of environmental factors, because of genetics, and so forth. So this is how, when we are older in life, how we get regeneration after trauma for many of our organs, not for everything. For instance, as you know, the brain does not regenerate. You lose a neuron, a cell from the brain, it's gone forever. But liver has the capacity to regenerate very fast and very much. This happens because of cells like this and their ability to transform into specialized, differentiated cell types, as we call them. So all of this, of course, has a lot of potential for what feels as regenerative medicine, important for people who age, for people with diseases, for people in trauma. So there's a lot of attention and a lot of research dollars going into this. And so this person named Woo Suk Hwang, who is fortunately or unfortunately a veterinarian. I don't know what that says about our profession. I always found this to be how do you call it, sort of tragic in some ways. He has been very famous in Korea. He was famous before he published this research because he had been very good in cloning animals. He had perfected the cloning of cows and of pigs, of farm animals, which is happening in other parts of the world as well. It's not something that was unique to him, but he was very good at it. And as you know, very often research in humans is preceded by work in animals and animal models, right? This is one of the ways that science progresses. We try things in animals. And so one of the things that he did, almost in parallel with his research on the human embryonic stem cells, is that he cloned a dog. And while this sounds simple, it was in fact not simple at all. So this paper was published in Nature, and most of the comments from the rest of the world, which is really, if you think about it, quite uncommon, were that this was unnecessary research, and given the numbers that of eggs and dogs, so animals, and the kinds of risks that these animals were put in order to get one cloned puppy, most of the comments were negative. It was an unnecessary scope of research and experiments. And so for those of you who do animal research, you can understand that 123 female dogs is an extraordinary number to use to create something, and something that is, one can actually, question the utility of having it, except to have it done. So, but his work on the animal cloning sort of passed into second category, if you will, the minute he published the first paper where he said he was able to create and sustain human embryonic stem cells in culture, cells that came from what we call cloned cells, which meant that those cells were manipulated to begin with, and he was able to perpetrate them in cell culture. So this became an international headline overnight, and everyone focused on this achievement that he created. So Liz is going to talk about some of the ethical issues that came together with this publication. But before she does that, I'd like to show you this slide. The picture on the left corner says Pride of Korea. The whole nation of Korea focused on this man. They were extremely proud of his accomplishments. They named him superior scientist. They gave him extraordinary amounts of money to fund his research further, and the whole country followed his accomplishments and his publications in the global community. Every day, everybody was following him. It was as if he embodied their achievement status, if you will. And that's important to know because it manifests a different way of science around a scientist, of society around a scientist. On the right is, as you perhaps might know, Time magazine publishes once a year a list of the most influential people of that year. And so in 2004, he was one of those people. And so, but while all of this was happening, there was a conversation in Korea about ethical concerns with the research that he had just done. And so Liz is going to talk about this with you for a few more minutes.
So when we think about ethical issues, many people don't think first about ethical issues in science. They think first about bioethical issues in human beings, particularly in research and in reproductive health. And because the question of stem cells, embryonic stem cells, depends on taking eggs from women and fertilizing them in vitro, we already, by beginning to think about embryonic stem cell research, not thinking about the laboratory science, we have the social, ethical, and religious issues that tend to be immediate in people's minds when we think about that science. And Dr. Huang was controversial because in the 2000s there was a lot of debate about whether we should be making human embryos for research in the first place. It remains controversial in many parts of the world whether we should be doing in vitro fertilization where the embryos are intended to become babies. But it is even more so to ask the question about making embryos for research purposes that will never become human children. And this was a major issue that came about with Dr. Huang's research, because where did the embryos come from that he did research with? And the answer appeared in blogs in Korea. Not formally asked, but gossip. Science gossip, where people anonymously posted messages about what was really going on in the laboratories of the superstar scientists. And the answer to where the eggs came from, we don't know where the sperm came from, but where did the eggs come from? They came from women working in Dr. Huang's lab. Laboratory assistants, postdoctoral fellows, and graduate students underwent hormonal treatment and then had eggs removed laparoscopically, and their eggs were then fertilized to be used for research. So the first question that came up in terms of the science that Dr. Huang was doing was a question of human research and human reproduction. And then people began to ask the question, what is the relationship between this faculty member, this famous superstar scientist, and the junior researchers and the students working in his lab? Between this superstar national hero and the people whom he supervised, and in particular the women scientists whom he supervised. The question of what the women had to gain. Why would they put their eggs forward for research? Why would they undergo the procedure to get hyperovulation, to then have surgically removed or laparoscopically removed eggs? Were they doing it for science? Were they doing it to get closer to the national hero? Were they doing it for some other personal gain? We don't know whose eggs and embryos ultimately became the stem cells that he did work on. But he also paid financially for the eggs that were donated, and $1,400 each for the women who gave eggs. And that became a question in Korea, should we be paying people for egg donation? Especially paying people for egg donation for research, which is already a question since the eggs are not going to become babies. Did the women fully understand the risk they ran by getting the hormonal treatment and the fact that those eggs would never be regrown, so they may become infertile, may not be able to have their own children into the future? Many of the women did egg donation multiple times, which increased their risk. And there was no evidence that there had been written informed consent, that they knew or had been informed what they were doing. And then finally, the question when Dr. Huang was asked about this, he denied having any knowledge about where the eggs came from. And he didn't think about the fact that there might be responsibility, even if he didn't know how the eggs came about, that he had a responsibility as a scientist to know the quality of the material he was working with and the ethical means by which it was obtained. So the first scientific question was a question that came up about the human reproductive ethics and the human research ethics. And we find that often scientific questions are not in the forefront of people's minds, but they are still there. And what we see with Dr. Huang is the fact that we then got into other questions related to ethics. In 2005, January, after this publication came out, the Korean government and the Korean people, in response to this problem that their national hero had gotten into, created a new law, the Bioethics and Biosafety Act, that included provisions that made it illegal to sell eggs, and made it very clear where this kind of research fell in terms of human safety and human research. And for a while, everybody thought that the ethical issues were resolved. We have a new law. Dr. Wong had previously acted at a time when there was no regulation of the practice, so no one could blame him for misbehaving because there was no standard in the law that told him what he could and could not do. Then there came the second publication. And this is when national and international acclaim and fame and tremendous news response to Dr. Huang came about. In the second publication on stem cells, published in Science in May of 2005, Dr. Huang said that he had been able to take patient-specific genetic material and create patient-specific embryos and stem cells that could be used to regenerate tissue for people with diseases. This was a tremendous breakthrough. Scientifically, it had never been achieved. It had been dreamed of. Many people were worried about the ethics. Should we be using embryos in this way? But Dr. Huang and 24 colleagues published a groundbreaking paper entitled Patient-Specific Embryonic Stem Cells Derived from Human Stem Cell Nuclear Transfer Blastocysts, so using the procedure that Lita had talked about. And the idea that this would open a revolutionary new area of medicine was something that everybody was talking about. But then the scandal began to break. In November of 2005, colleagues, again speaking anonymously, often through the internet, began to raise questions about whether Dr. Huang was, in violation of the law, still using human embryos obtained from eggs that he should not have paid for and got from people who weren't truly consenting. And the question of whether he might still be breaking the law began to unravel the perfect picture that he had created for his research. In November of 2005, Dr. Gerald Shatton, whom we see here, a senior collaborator at University of Pittsburgh, suddenly announced, quietly announced, but announced that he was no longer affiliated with Dr. Huang. He was not collaborating with him any longer, and he was choosing to disavow the previous work. And in fact, there then became, in November and December of 2005, a lot of discussion about some potential problems with the second paper. Was the second paper scientifically all that it said that it was? In January of 2006, then, a panel was convened in Korea to look at what had been done in the research. Was the research true? Was what the research had laid out in the paper all accurate? Were the stem cells actually cloned in the way that the paper reported? And the Korean university issued a report in January, and both papers were retracted. Papers were retracted on the grounds that they could not be replicated, on the grounds that they were in fact not following what had been said in the paper had been done, and that the results were not accurate. And in fact, it later came out that part of what had happened was fabrication and falsification of the images of the cells, that they were not in fact cloned, they were reproduced using Photoshop. So that the breakthrough that had been described had not occurred. In February of 2006, the University of Pittsburgh began to investigate Dr. Shatton and his role, and Dr. Shatton made a startling announcement that he had not actually been involved in any of that research. He was just an author on the paper. And the question then of whether he had engaged in misconduct became an important one. In March of 2006, Dr. Huang lost his license to do the kind of research that he had been doing, recognizing again that he had been a national hero, his licensure had been unquestioned, and he was taken away from his laboratory. It was then discovered that when he was collecting eggs that he had taken, not he personally, but over 2,000 eggs had been obtained from women on his staff, a large staff, but still 2,000 eggs. And the questions of how to think about the research that came after were only clouded by the fact that he suddenly did not have the support of his team. People who had been working with him began talking both openly and quietly to the media, and the perfect picture of the perfect scientist was destroyed. So we would like to spend a few minutes with you thinking about this case as a case you could teach about, to teach your students about responsible science. Recognizing we have given you a very small snapshot of the case of Dr. Huang, and that we have emphasized already a little bit about the questions that come up when we read a very short summary of this. We were both teaching responsible conduct of research at the time this case broke, and every day there was a new step and a new thing. I can't believe that happened. And it was an excellent opportunity, and we took it to begin teaching about how to read the news, how to read newspaper and journal accounts, and teach ethics from what's in the news. So we would like to think with you about topics that you see in this case that you think you would be interested in teaching. We're going to do an activity now that we call shout out. Please raise your hand before shouting. But we're going to take the notes of the topics, not the whole big question, just the topics. And then we're later going to look at how to take topics that you see and integrate them and build them into a coherent kind of presentation for talking about with your students. So Lita, if you will.
So may I ask just one?
Yes, and that's a good thing.
Yes.
Questions for?
Yes. Last semester we had a debate with my student about stem cell, and me and my student we evolved about this case. And to be honest, our student present this issue for us within the stem cell debate, and we came with about a point last semester about the university, not just Dr. Huang. So we're responsible for the university. So because when we're talking about research, we're talking about grant, correct? So then the follow-up of her grant, and then every single research we have to submit a report by the end of the semester, correct? Or the end of year, depending on the grant. So that means the university be involved really, not just about the Dr. Huang.
So did everyone hear that it's not just the researchers, it's the entire university that has a responsibility? So, yes, sir.
Once, I think once discovered human embryonic stem cell. But I think in the past, mouse's embryonic stem cells was used in this bacteria. Is he the same person that discovered mouse embryonic stem cells?
No, but you raise a good question. How do we get from mouse to human?
Yeah, I know, because a lot of advantage concerning the human embryonic stem cells other than mouse embryonic.
So if we say animal model to human model, where do we make the How do we make that transition?
Yes, I'm asking because we are regarding this paper, we are in a dilemma because it's not one of it's 24. Do all the 24 recognize the fabrication of data and get silent? No one
So
of
the
them.
responsibility of each of the 24 authors.
24, it's not
Okay.
one. And
Okay.
I think Shatan is American.
He is
He is
American.
American.
That's right.
And collaborate, his name mentioned in the paper.
He was the so in science, that's not the case, same in every field, but in many scientific fields, the last name on a series of names is what we call the senior author, which means that this person is either, this research is done in his laboratory, or he has the grants and the vision that this research is part of. And so generally it carries a weight. That name carries a weight. It's like a certificate of excellence, if you will, for the research, right?
But I want to know, this arises the question, what is the responsibility of
The
each
senior
author?
author, yes, that's right. What is the responsibility of each author?
You're
Yes.
sitting at the wrong table then, because that's one of the things we're going to talk about.
Yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask what was why, for example, the science journal hasn't, had no chance to recognize the actual issue, before the publication.
So
Why
was the
didn't?
peer review,
Yeah,
the peer review. So the role of the peer review.
What I mean is that why the journal has no, panel or some committee to peer review the ethical issue before publications, before any paper go for publication.
Okay, right, all right, yes. Nice.
I wonder if there is an ethical committee review over this.
You mean, he mentioned ethical committee at the level of the journal. Do you mean in the level of the country?
Yeah, the level of the institution.
Yes, okay. All right, ethics review at the institution, okay. Next, other, yes.
The responsibility of everybody in the research work and the knowledge of the research work of his name on this paper are the same of misconduct and wrongdoing, and they should go to court. They should go to court, not just. I guess it's not enough to
So-
go to ethical
Criminal issues,
This is a criminal act.
criminal investigation, okay. All right, yes.
On the level of the nation.
I'm sorry?
At the level of nation, was there any national ethical committee that they from the ethical approval, the
Okay. So ethics review at the national level?
national level?
Yes, okay. Yes.
The responsibility of the government, because the government stopped women to give eggs, but
Okay.
they don't stop it research.
Okay. So the monitoring, there's the monitoring function of a government body. Okay.
But when you're talking about the donation, since it's under category of donation and also spending, so there is no problem.
So what is
So-
donation then for research? How is that defined or protected?
Yes.
Okay.
And then if it's, the director signs a document between the research and then to be
Okay.
So that's it, there is no problem.
The consent form, we call that the consent form. Yes.
Would that happen if there was less teaching, or curriculum, ethics curriculum being taught in the universities, for example?
Okay, so what is the role of ethics curricula in this case? Let me move this, you need to work on it, right?
And not to have too much conflict of interest, we all want there to be a role for ethics education. Whether it works is another question.
Other comments? Okay. So, Liz, you have enough? You have enough?
I think I have enough.
Okay.
So let me say, just ask. Could you teach for an hour on this class? Could you teach for a week on this class? Could you teach a course for a semester on this case?
Well, this in
Why not?
Yeah. And that's only with that much information on this case.
So let me see.
I moved this back a little bit.
Okay, all right. So this is the criminal issues that you raised. So the indictment and the trial. So he, along with some of his collaborators who were all co-authors in the papers, along with others who were not indicted, they were put on trial. They were found guilty, but strangely enough, they were not found guilty, or he was actually not found guilty of research fraud himself, but he was found guilty of abusing money. When we say embezzlement, he took money for his own purposes or donations and so forth, and he did other ethics violations. So, but while he was not found guilty of fraud, some of his other collaborators, more junior colleagues, were found guilty of fraud. So this wasn't just about him, it was about more people. So after that, there are still, since then, there have still been people in Korea who believe very much in what he does. So even though he was fired from the university, which was a public institution, he was able to create his own private laboratory. This is it. It's called Suwang Biotech. He has a lot of private donors, a lot of them. I must continue to be astounded at this. So this is the first, the landing page on the website about what are some of the things that they do. You may notice that they do particularly dog cloning, and so this is the explanation of what exactly it is that they do. They can clone your dead dog. So if you do not want Snoopy or whatever, your dog is named, to die, so you can take cells from that dog, just dead, passed away, and they can create a new one for you at the cost of significant thousands of dollars, 60, 100,000, something like this. But in addition to this, he's also, I think, working with the Russians to persevere and recreate mammoths, woolly mammoths. I think he's also working on other endangered species. I'm not sure how good this research is, but these are the things that come up in the news every so often.
And he's not publishing in Science anymore.
That's it.